Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I'm not too sure if you can never quite tell if this thing's on when you're in front of it. So, if everyone can hear me, that's good. My name's Michael Hawker. I'm the Associate Curator of Australian Art at the Gallery. And this afternoon I'd like to give you a talk about a new exhibition that's opening in Gallery 14, which is on the work of Richard Stringer. And I'm sure a lot of you in this room would know Richard and know of Richard's history as a photographer in Queensland over the last 40 odd years, which is quite an amazing achievement in itself. This is quite a lovely photo we have of Richard, courtesy of Marguerite, Richard's wife. Which, if some of you don't know Richard and what he looks like. And this I put up, I just thought this was a lovely little sort of thing Richard said about how he sort of goes about the task of photographing his works and that. And I just thought I'd put that up so you could read it and just see his idea of what sort of motivates him as a photographer. I might just read it out to you so if some of you can't. It says, every site has its own ethos. I like to research a site before I visit it. Once there, I like to walk through without the camera or sit and just observe. Eventually comes the realisation that unless I get moving, there'll be no photographs. So the rest of the day is spent keeping up with the sun. So it's quite a lovely little... I'd like to start the talk by actually asking a question, and we can go from there. And the question is, why is it that some photographs hold our interest and give us pleasure, while others, apparently similar, do not? Despite photography's ubiquitous presence in our lives, we continue to struggle for an answer, all the while supported by the sureness and the intensity of our experience when we observe photographs. Whether we delight in the form of the composition or our interest lies in the subject, there is no doubt that the most affecting photographs have a quality that commands our attention. The photographs of Richard Stringer are absorbing, and over his 40-year practice have demonstrated an enduring ability to engage the viewer. Early developments in photography led to divergent aims. The desire to align the medium with the aesthetic traditions of 19th century painting and the more pragmatic approach to use photography as a tool of factual documentation. Historically, photography has kept pace with the culture of scientific rationality and the desire to collect, assemble and order modern society in the museum and archive. The start of the 20th century saw the advent of photographic modernism, as marked by the rebuff to subjective painterly pictorialism and the turn to clear description and objectivity in photography. Even with the demise of pictorialist photography and the rise of factual photography, the debate regarding form and content continued. The contest pitched the simple capacity of photography to produce a likeness against its ability to create a subtle artistic construct, a fictive fact, revealing the essence of reality far more effectively than a straightforward replication. If this personal response to the object is lacking, then the end result amounts to little more than a matter of pointing out what is there under the guise of authenticity. Therefore, the photographs of Richard Stringer can be considered in terms framed by the curator Thomas Wesky, who said, "If the photographer succeeds in penetrating more deeply into the subject, then we can relish in the photographer's observational ability to charge the familiar with additional meaning, and we can enjoy the sensation of being confronted with a form of autonomy that we recognise from the world of visual art." In this context, I would like to explore some of the qualities and subjects of Richard Stringer's photography, which are explored in the current exhibition in Gallery 14. The overriding influence on Richard's photography is his abiding attentiveness to architecture. Although Stringer was deeply influenced by his father, photographing ballet dancers in post-war Melbourne, his attention turned to photography as a result of his training and practice in architecture. Stringer's father was a keen amateur photographer who documented over 5 decades of Australian dance and included material relating to resident companies as well as visiting troops. While working as an architect in Brisbane in the 1960s, Richard realised how difficult it was for professional photographers to document an architect's commission. While architectural photography aims for accurate representation of a subject, it must, like all good photography, engage the viewer in a dialogue, one that conveys something of the art of the architect. At the same time, it records the pragmatic concerns of design and structure. Richard succinctly speaks of this challenge in this little quote. The building has to be seen in relation to its surroundings. While the doorknob might be significant, it is not the whole building. Throughout the history of photography, architecture has always been a popular subject, mirroring our appreciation of both its cultural significance and its index of historical change. Stringer began documenting architecture when he established his own photographic business in 1967. He soon became Brisbane's go-to architectural photographer because of his nuanced understanding of the built environment and architectural principles. I'll just show you these are some examples here of some earlier images that Richard took. This is the New Zealand Insurance Building, which is no more, that was in the centre of Brisbane. Example of a lovely cornice, the Regent Theatre, which is no more, of course. And Milton Park and Bowral, which is a garden scene. Stringer's practice expanded with commissions from National Trust of Queensland and from the support and influence of Sydney architect Harold Tanner to record historic buildings and gardens. As a result, his photography has played a major role in chronicling the architecture of Brisbane and Queensland, and his photographs have helped mark out the signature of many of the state's most successful architects of the past 4 decades. Stringer is acutely aware of belonging to a continuing tradition of photography in Australia and is especially admiring of the Australian photographers Harold Casno and Max Dupain. Like them, he is guided by the principles of documentary photography, addressing his subject with a keen eye honed by a desire to represent it as honestly as possible, while opening it to new interpretations and understandings. Like Casino and Dupain, Stringer's compositions also convey the modernist mantra of structure, light and detail, and that's what you get in these images. Exterior architectural photography takes advantage of available daylight. Power and the quality of light is of special importance to Stringer's compositions. Leaving very little to chance, he carefully calculates the position of the sun to determine the day's shooting schedule so as to achieve the best effects from each of his chosen locations. In architectural interiors, light falls differently through doors, windows, skylights, or from lighting fixtures, and under Stringer's control, light articulates the character of a place. A soft luminosity is achieved in Manager's House Ilfracombe, Woolscow in 1975 in this image, where the derelict floorless interior is lit by a row of windows to the rear of the building. Here Stringer shows us an almost magical stillness in what was once a lively family home. His compositions also communicate the aesthetic harmony of architecture and context. Taking advantage of foreground trees, statues or fountains, he leads the eye into the composition towards its central subject. In House Roman, 1982, the elegance of a traditional Queenslander and the delicate lacework of its wrought iron veranda are framed through a bottle tree in the foreground. The imposing mass of the deeply cast shadow of the tree trunk with its spreading branches just catches the light that falls full on the house behind. All elements are drawn together in a simple and direct contrast: light, shade, lacework, dark mass, timber and iron. Stringer's governing principle of form and shadow, structure, light and detail are at work, And we see this in these following images, which admirably display these qualities. You have the Treasury Building, Brisbane. Oh, sorry, what? And this one there. Oh. I did have another couple there. I don't know what's happened to those. Oh, well, anyway. That was a good example anyway. This one here at the Sydney Opera House, although Stringer is joined to capture the grand architectural structure to engage the viewer, this is not always the case. And we see this was a lovely image here of the Brampton Island Airport. I don't know, some of you may have known this structure in the past. A colleague of mine at work was telling me a lovely story just the other day about this. She went out to the Brampton Island some years ago, and she said it was a real surreal experience because you could see this sort of structure above the sand dunes from the beach, and it was sort of a really marvellous thing to see. But I wanted to include this because Richard also focuses on the quite quirky and sort of unusual images as well, which sort of capture his attention. And I think this is a really good example of this as well. They're quite offbeat images that equally engage us as the more sort of traditional structures of architecture. And even sort of images like this, Richard shows how they have something to say to us as well, which is really good. Oh, there it is. That's Victoria Bridges. That's the one that's gone out of sequence. So another example of the sort of lovely elements of shadow, structure and light that we were talking about in these images. And Independent Church, which I think is apparently the St Michael's Uniting Church in Collins Street in Melbourne now. It's changed its name, so interior. It's quite lovely. Once when I was visiting the Stringers, my eye was caught by a framed photograph of the Bellevue Hotel. It was on their wall, and if you recall the Bellevue, some of you will, of course, it was just pulled down on the 20th of April 1979 under order from the state government, who had scant regard for the cultural heritage of Brisbane's built environment at the time. What was remarkable about this image on the wall, I thought, though, was that Richard had added wooden fragments of the actual demolition site included with his image of the work, and this work is actually in the collection in the display in Gallery 14 when you go and see that there. But the reason I was really fascinated by that was that was that it reminded me of the story of a very esteemed American photographer, Walker Evans, who near the end of his working life was asked about the relationship between his habits as a collector and his work as a photographer, and he said, it's almost the same thing. And I thought this was a lovely, sort of simple way of expressing this idea, and I was intrigued how Richard had sort of picked these items up as well. Evans was his prolific practice as well is characterised by photographs of everyday objects, road signs, discarded objects and the like, all collected through the act of photography. And what I found really fascinating and interesting about that is that collecting and photography share a faith in the taken object, as well as an understanding that this taking is fundamentally transformative, implying that to make something, anything, the subject of a photograph is to appropriate it in some way and to insist it is worthy of attention, no matter how incidental or humble or useful it may seem. And I think, just show you this. This is a very good example of Richard's image of something that others may see as something that's quite an eyesore and the blight on the landscape, an old gravel pit. And there was a number of these around Brisbane in the 60s and 70s, which they're all gone now, of course, but this is a lovely sort of representation of that. And Richard sort of spoke to me about these and why he loved them, and he said it was because of the immense sort of sculptural forms of the wooden structures in the gravel yards, and so he sees this sort of beauty in what others may see as quite ugly and a blot on the landscape. I think this is one thing sort of to understand about Richard, is that in many ways he's teaching us how to see when we look at his photographs, which is really lovely and amazing. Stringer is a bowerbird and chronicler, and these tendencies find their natural expression in the systematic recording of our environment, built and natural. This is just an example of a church at Gatton in this regard. Another example of this sort of recording the environment is fretwork pediments. There was actually a show that Richard did in 1982, I believe it was, at the University of Queensland, in which it was, the whole show was fretwork pediments of Queensland at the University of Queensland Art Museum in 82. And this sort of gives you this is an image from that show. It gives us the idea of this sort of idea of chronicling the history and architecture of the state. And just go back to that Rylance, this one here, which is just out of order. Stringer has made contributions to many publications on Queensland and Australian architecture and cultural history, which seems fitting as his photographs lend themselves to seriality and groupings. As I said, it's generally acknowledged that a significant strand of modernist photography relies on this concept of seriality. And I'm immediately drawn, when you think about that, to sort of famous modernist photographers like Bernhard and Hilla Becker, the German photographers, and how they sort of recorded the industrial buildings and structures of Germany and Europe. And I'm thinking about that with Richard as well. I'm sort of drawn to the idea that, in a way, it takes people like that to do a whole group of images to get your interest and attention, and then you can go back to the individual images. It takes that sort of accumulation of all those images together to sort of ignite people's interest and sort of passion in looking at these images more closely. And then when you see them in a whole group, particularly, this is why a lot of modernist photography is sort of represented in books and that, in seriality in that regard, you'll go back and then you'll see an individual image in a lot more clarity and detail, because of course you've seen the impressive quantity of them all together, I think, which is very sort of interesting. And this is just a sort of a lovely image of Richard's, just a display of the Rylance brickworks and the casting boxes, and all grouped and gathered together, which give this sort of this sense of the accumulation of things put together, which can have a sort of make some lovely patterns and displays as well. Richard's a keen student of history. He's fascinated, this fascination can be seen in other projects he's done over the years, particularly in the past, a publication called The Shifting Town, Glass Plate Images of Claremont and Its People by G.C. Puller. This was a publication produced with his wife Marguerite in 1986. Similarly, Harold Tanner's The Art of Gardening in Colonial Australia in 1979, together with a number of publications for the National Trust, demonstrates how Richard's initial fascination with architecture attuned his eye to all manner of aspects of the historical environment, from where he went out from there. Richard's compositions also communicate the aesthetic harmony of... Oh, sorry. I'm getting... sorry. Stringer is one of the few photographers working in Queensland who has consistently sought out and recorded the design, craftsmanship and character of threatened buildings across the state, as we see in an image like this of Blackhall Masonic Lodge. And also with the interior of Cloudland Ballroom, which some of you will remember as well. Over 4 decades, Richard has documented, collected and archived thousands of photographs to acknowledge what has been, what is and may not be with us in the future, as point in case. Richard's architectural studies have helped him to understand what lies beneath the surface of things. They have taught him to look and to see, and to make things visible to those of us with untrained eyes or who look too quickly or too little at images. In Stringer's work, there's always a close consideration of the economic and historical influences on the environments he records. We see a scientific-like approach to stock taking in his archive of these sites as an inquiry into the relationship between people and time. Stringer's photographs explore the social and cultural contexts that have led to current conditions, while the disquieting stillness of his images often belies the noisy history of the actual sites depicted. Most of these works are black and white photographs which lend themselves to a timelessness associated with a documentary tradition. In Door to the Bathhouse, Rhonda Colliery, 1990, a derelict interior is illuminated by window light, which draws the eye to wooden benches and a pair of discarded boots, symbols of the absent presence of boisterous miners and the past productivity that shaped the working lives of the community. And I think this is very much what Richard's about, recording communities and how they existed and how these things have gone now and moved on. These are just further examples of Richard's sense of history and capturing it with the Australia Day floods in '74. The big crane Evans Deacon, some of you may remember that, it's on the skyline at Kangaroo Point many years ago. Our own Queensland Art Gallery in Watermall, when it was first day of opening in 1982. And a lovely view of Brisbane in the bicentenary year of 1988. It's a beautiful image of the clouds and the site. By 1963, Richard had chosen to work with large format cameras, giving him the ability to achieve high levels of detail in his images, as well as considerable control of perspective to emphasise order and structure. The view is always carefully selected to ensure its constituent elements combine to present a strong and engaging composition. This is particularly evident for what he calls his industrial archaeological subjects, where his aim is to, quote, see what has been made in the past, what it has become, and to bring to the observer something of its past life and its present decay which, in its slow return to the elements from which it came, has a beauty of its own. His interest in ruins and dilapidated sites also points in tradition described in Pleasures of Ruin, 1953, a book by Rose Macaulay, which writes of the contribution made by ruins in their depiction to popular sensibility. As Macaulay argues, the romanticism that swept European art and literature at the turn of the 19th century can be characterised by the fact that the human race is and has always been ruin-minded, and that all ages have found beauty in the dark and violent forces, physical and spiritual, of which ruin is one symbol. This sensibility is evident in many of Richard's images, such as Breezeway and Gary Sugarmill, 1974, in which he records the sheer visual pleasure of the movement of grass buffeted by wind in the arched doorway of a ruined wall of the old mill, the symbol of nature taking back a landscape once emphatically inscribed with their own making and dwelling. Similarly, Goat's St Helena Prison, 1977, depicts the creatures standing sentinel-like on the collapsing prison walls, observing the photographer as he works. In capturing this unlikely moment, nature is seen as ultimately holding dominion over all. So, again, I sort of this sense of Richard picking up on the moment as well, with a sort of this sort of image of the goats just appearing and sort of fixing them with their beady eye. Also, although Stringer notes that he initially chose to ignore colour and go to black and white because the photographs lasted better and I could do everything myself, with advances in digital reproduction, earlier problems have been eliminated, allowing him to enjoy the level of control now possible in dealing with tone and colour. And this is a very good example of that. This beautiful use of colour is evident in Slad Blockwork, Mount Chalmers Copper and Gold Mine, 1975, where he captures the colours of variegated copper in the blockwork created from mining slag, which in turn has been weathered by time. Richard told me an interesting story of this, that sometime after he'd been up and taken these photographs, it was quite an amazing area of the mine, that these things were all sort of bulldozed into the pit, so it's all gone now, so, which is a sad thing, but he's captured it anyway, which is great. Other examples of this sort of capturing of this, the history that's now gone is the Western Star Roma, a newspaper, and the old printing presses, which are no longer used. The paper's still going though, which is interesting. Didmore Pottery Kiln, another, which is out towards Ipswich, of course, and the Rylands Bricks Works near it. Capturing the lovely, I always think the lovely textures of the floor with the heats that are built up is quite amazing, and the sort of the glazes and that sort of splattered on the ceiling of the kiln. And this beautiful image of Final Call of the Dredge, Brisbane, and the Brisbane River, which is another sort of lovely sort of image of an old sort of worn out dredge. It's been tied up before its destruction. Richard's other enduring interest lies in responding to the natural world. Whether a Stradbroke Island beachscape or the rich textures of grass and foliage in a bush setting, his works show a delight in the forms of nature. His nature photographs are also based on the tenets of clarity and detail. We see the precise definition of grass stalks, ocean waves and rocky shores. The architect's eye remains alert to the structure and layering of native vegetation in an organic architectural space. So very much I think that life as an architect is still coming very much out in his representations of nature, where he's actually looking back into the forms of nature for those sort of similar structures that you see in architecture, verticals and horizontals and it's like that. Despite the rarity of colour in his works, he uses it to full effect to render the infinite chromatic range of vegetation and earth in its Eden-like state. And we see this in this lovely image here, which emphasises the constancy of nature, its twisted balletic structures filling a shimmering stage. So this is apparently on Stradbroke Island, this image. So it's quite a large image in the actual show, so when you go to see it, it's quite sort of imposing, which is really great to see it blown up to a larger size. This is another black and white of Gumtree's Mount Emu Creek, and you sort of really get this sense of the sculptural forms, tree forms, but again we have this similar appeal of nature with this sort of structural elements very much evident in an image like this. And something a little quirky, which is, I think, again, where we're talking about Richard capturing the moment when he sort of just comes upon something and sort of realises, this will make a good photograph. And you have this in Taxonomy Royal Botanic Gardens, and the tree's been cut down and someone's carefully placed the little tag, the little sign, which gives you all the Latin name and everything on top of the piles of wood. It's that quirky sort of humour coming through in the image, which is great. Another lovely little Billabong Creek Jerilderie. We sort of here, you see more of the sort of the foreground tonal variations of grasses and flowers, which is sort of quite lovely. And there's sort of another lovely one here, Melaleuca and Reeves Mayora. And this is a very large image in the exhibition, and you really get a sense of an image like this being almost like an etching when you actually get up close and look at it, sort of with all the grass and so individually marked out, so clear and precise, which is really lovely. And another very impressive work with this one here. This one's very interesting because it immediately draws my attention to someone who played with this idea of collage, photographic collage in the past, particularly in the 1980s, which was David Hockney. And I think this is sort of a lovely sort of play on that, his work with photo collage as well. And I think with something like this, you can see it's been made up, this lovely cascade of the pandanus roots coming down is made up of individual little images, photographs of the roots, which Richard has all sort of put together in sequence, and how it sort of falls down the page or the photo as it comes down. But it's sort of like, it's micro perspectives, which in a way sort of shows us how we tend to see in ourselves, how we look at things, because we tend not to take something in its entirety. We tend to our eyes alight on certain things of an image, and then we sort of draw back and alight on something else with sort of, and this is sort of very much of that sort of that feel of sort of drawing attention to that sort of idea of how we actually see things. And I also get a really sense of time in it as well, because each individual shot was taken out of, like, in sequence. So time was sort of going forward as he was doing this, and it's sort of capturing something over a period of time, which is very interesting as well. And I think this is why Hockney enjoyed using this sort of method when he was playing with it as well in the 1980s. He described it as being almost like a drawing tool for him, and I think Richard sort of uses it in this way as well, which is quite fascinating and interesting. And I think also it's like Hockney sort of describes it as this sort of thing as being a great pleasure in trying to make people see, and I think that Richard sees this also, that sort of trying to make people see things differently and more sort of intensely in an image like this. Although the human figure rarely intrudes into the frame of Richard's photographs, their spectral forms inhabit many works. Like the work of the French photographer Eugène Auger, who documented old Paris, Stringer's photographs of the built environment are redolent of a human presence. Stringer is in fact a very fine portrait photographer. In his portraits you see his proficiency to convey something very specific about his city's identity. This is just a general one, but I just sort of included it because it's a lovely sort of play of the image of the guy standing looking up the street and the statue peering after him. Which is it. But I think Richard tends to sort of play down his ability to photograph people, and I think he captures a sort of a great sort of there's something really sort of lovely how he sort of catches people in his images, which he doesn't give himself enough credit for, I think. This is a lovely work of Luke Roberts at Bellis Gallery, and I think we're talking about how he sort of expresses something of the person he's photographing in an image like this. Luke Roberts, he addresses the artist's theatrical persona while maintaining the sense of performance as a farce in this image, and I think he captures so well a well-known performance artist in Brisbane like Luke in an image like this, which is really lovely. Another one of Scott Redford, which is very good. This is very interesting because Richard's actually played with this image and he's inverted it upside down, and he's done this for a particular purpose to, as you notice with the title, Apotheosis of Scott Redford, which is a lovely sort of play on that idea of apotheosis being someone being drawn up to the divine or taken up into heaven. And he's sort of playing with this as sort of almost like Scott's lying on the canvas but sort of being drawn up. And Richard describes it as... he said, this could be one of the largest of Scott's work. It occurred to me that it would make a wonderful ceiling with the same impact as one found in Baroque Europe. And I'm sort of thinking about something like this, and I immediately think of the ceiling in the Banquet House in London, there's an image of King James I being taken up into heaven on the ceiling with sort of cherubs and everything around him. There's a sort of a similar idea, and that's as well, which is quite good. Another beautiful image of Emily Kamkamware. And I think you get a lovely sense of the play of the light and the shadow, particularly playing over the canvas that she's working on, and which is really quite beautiful. And another image which really works so beautifully well in colour, which is and here we have a Van Wallace. This was done in 2004. In this case, Richard frames Anne Wallace in what appears to be one of her own paintings. If anyone is aware of Anne's work, this is very much like her work, like her own oil paintings. And again, the architect's eye of Richard combines the geometric formalism of the interior of the artist's home with the confident naturalism of Wallace in a doorway. It's quite a lovely image of her. So, I think what's really important with these sort of images, particularly which he's done a lot of capturing of artists in Brisbane and in Queensland, is that he plays a significant role in recording the cultural life of Brisbane and Queensland in the past, and I think this is really important as well. as well as appreciating these people as kindred spirits almost, so, which is good. I might wind up there. And conclude, and then we might just have a few questions, if that's all right. But I just want to conclude and say that about the exhibition, that the images featured in Pleasure of Place photographs by Richard Stringer span the creative work of a lifetime. At the same time, they merely glance the surface of Richard's prodigious output. They show the remarkable achievements of an artist who has diligently pursued his craft while always considering the ineffable sense of what makes a great image, and how photography can amplify the qualities of what appears before the lens. At the centre of Richard's unique achievement lies a sense of history. The continuum permeates his work and brings the past to us in the present, so it may be preserved for future audience. In the artist's words, I decided that maybe I could make people aware by showing them. I could exploit the veracity of photographs, especially if I showed things in the usual way that they were experienced without any trickery. Here we see something of the photographer himself and what continues to drive and inform his passion for the medium. There is much to admire and celebrate in Richard Stringer's photography. Thank you.